The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the rumors or the spreadsheets or even the delayed paychecks. It was the silence. Our office used to hum, keyboards clacking, low conversations drifting over cubicle walls, the soft hiss of the industrial coffee machine fighting a losing battle against exhaustion. But that Monday morning, when I stepped off the elevator onto the 7th floor, the sound vanished. People sat rigid at their desks, staring at monitors without really seeing them. Conversations died the second someone walked by. Laughter had become a liability. I stopped by my desk and turned on my computer, already knowing what I would find. The numbers from the previous quarter were open on my screen where I had left them the night before, glowing like an accusation. Red arrows everywhere, shrinking margins, cash reserves dug into and not replenished, a slow, undeniable slide toward a word no one in management dared to say aloud: bankruptcy. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly, counting the breaths the way my therapist had once taught me during a completely different crisis. 1, 2, 3. It didn't help. The truth weighed too much. 3 years earlier, this company had been unstoppable. A mid-sized tech firm with just enough innovation to attract attention and just enough arrogance to believe attention would never fade. We hired aggressively, expanded recklessly, and spent money like future profits were guaranteed by natural law. I watched it happen from my corner of the analytics department, running projections no one asked for and spotting inefficiencies no one wanted to hear about. Now the bill had come due. My phone buzzed with a message from Claire in accounting. Any news on salaries? I typed a response, deleted it, typed again. Nothing official. Still, processing delays. We both knew what that meant. Processing delays didn't stretch into their 3rd week without something rotten underneath. Around us, the Whisper network had already filled in the blanks. Credit lines frozen, investors panicking, leadership scrambling behind closed doors. Mark Reynolds' door had been shut for almost 2 days straight. Mark was my manager. Technically, in practice, he was a polished mouthpiece with a talent for sounding decisive while saying very little. He wore confidence like armor and surrounded himself with people who wouldn't challenge him. I had challenged him. Once. Early on. I didn't make that mistake twice. I opened a fresh spreadsheet and began updating projections with the latest data. Every adjustment made things worse, but also clearer. The story the numbers told was brutal, but straightforward. We weren't dying because of market conditions or bad luck. We were dying because of ourselves. Bloated departments, redundant tools, subscription services no one used but everyone paid for. Entire teams producing outputs that never translated into revenue. The irony made my jaw tighten. We didn't need a miracle. We needed discipline. By noon, I had skipped lunch without noticing. My inbox filled with vague calendar invites, financial alignment sync, strategic review, leadership update. None of them included me. Of course not. I was a senior analyst, not a decision maker. My job was to observe, report, and shut up. Still, people stopped by my desk. Is it true finance is freezing reimbursements? Have you heard if layoffs are coming? My manager says we're fine, but his eyes did this weird thing. I answered carefully, never speculating, never lying outright. Every word felt like walking a tightrope over a widening chasm. I could see morale draining by the hour, not in dramatic walkouts, but in subtle surrenders. The slumped shoulders, the slower typing, the resignation in people's eyes. Late that afternoon, a company-wide email finally arrived. We are aware of recent concerns regarding financial stability. Leadership is actively addressing these challenges. We appreciate your patience and continued dedication. I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Patience. Dedication. They were asking for more of what had already run out. As I packed up to leave, I caught my reflection in the darkened window. 32 years old. Good at my job. Invisible when it mattered. I had always believed that competence eventually rose to the surface, that good work spoke for itself if you gave it enough time. But watching this place bleed out in slow motion, I understood something I had been avoiding. Staying silent wasn't neutral. It was a choice. And if I made it, if I kept my head down and waited for leadership to figure it out, I wouldn't just lose this job. I would lose the chance to prove to myself more than anyone else that seeing the problem meant I had a responsibility to act. The elevator doors closed, and as we descended, I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app. I titled the document with a name that felt both arrogant and inevitable: Recovery Strategy. That night, I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't eat a proper dinner. I sat at my kitchen table long after the city outside had gone quiet, numbers spread before me like a battlefield map. If the company was going to fall, I wanted to know, with absolute certainty, that it wasn't because I was afraid to speak. I didn't sleep that night. By the time dawn smeared a pale, directionless light across my kitchen window, my table looked less like a workspace and more like the aftermath of a very specific obsession. Printed financial statements layered over each other, scribbled notes in the margins, coffee cups abandoned halfway through, and my laptop glowing with spreadsheets that had been recalculated so many times I'd memorized the formulas. At some point, exhaustion stopped dulling my thoughts and sharpened them instead. I wasn't guessing anymore. I wasn't theorizing. I was building something precise. The first mistake leadership had made was assuming the problem was singular. Revenue was down, yes, but that was just the symptom. The disease was structural. We had expanded in 4 directions at once without securing any of them. Entire departments were duplicating work. Vendor contracts had been signed at peak optimism and never renegotiated. Marketing was burning cash chasing vanity metrics, while sales chased the wrong clients with the wrong pricing model. I mapped everything. I started with expenses, not surface-level cost cutting, but surgical reduction. Tools no one actually used. Campaigns that produced leads nobody converted. Management roles whose sole function seemed to be managing meetings. I noted what could be paused, what could be downsized, and what needed to disappear entirely. It wasn't pretty. If implemented, people would notice. Some would hate it, but it would stop the bleeding. Then I moved to restructuring. Our org chart was a fossil record of past ambitions. I redrew it based on function and output, not seniority or politics. Teams aligned to revenue streams instead of vague goals, clear ownership, fewer layers, faster decisions. Accountability so obvious it couldn't be avoided. By midnight, the outline had become a system. By 3 a.m., it became a strategy. The last piece, the most important one, was growth. Real growth, not wishful thinking. I analyzed customer churn, pricing elasticity, retention costs. One pattern jumped out so clearly I laughed out loud in my empty apartment. Our most profitable feature wasn't even being marketed properly. Clients who used it stayed longer, paid more, and complained less. Yet sales treated it like a bonus instead of the product. So I flipped the model. I built a new pricing tier around that feature. Fewer clients, higher value, lower support drain. Not faster money, but cleaner money. Sustainable money. When I finally leaned back, my neck screamed in protest. I checked the clock. 6:12 a.m. I saved the document and stared at the title page. Operational Recovery and Stabilization Plan. It was 63 pages long. On the train to work, I rehearsed the conversation in my head. Not the technical parts, I knew those cold, but the tone. How to speak without sounding accusatory. How to present urgency without panic. How to make it clear that this wasn't criticism, it was a lifeline. Mark Reynolds didn't like surprises. He liked feeling in control. I arrived early and watched his office light turn on through the glass walls. He walked in with his usual confidence, coffee in hand, tie perfectly straight. I waited until his second cup before sending the message. Do you have 30 minutes today? I've identified a concrete path to stabilize our finances. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again, come by at 11. Those 4 words sent a pulse of adrenaline through me. At 10:58, I stood outside his office, my laptop under my arm, heartbeat thudding in my ears. I could still turn around. I could still keep quiet, let the process play out, preserve my professional safety. But I thought of Claire's message, the silence, the delayed salaries, and I knocked. Mark barely looked up at first. Close the door, he said, gesturing casually. What's on your mind? I took a breath and stepped forward, setting my laptop on the small table between us. This is the plan that can pull us out of bankruptcy. The word hung in the air, heavier than I expected. Mark's eyebrows lifted, not in alarm, but in interest. He leaned back slightly, folding his hands as if settling in for a presentation. I opened the document and began walking him through it, page by page, logic stacked cleanly on logic. I showed him the numbers as they were, not massaged, not softened, and then how they changed when each lever was pulled. Cost reductions first, structural alignment second, revenue focus last. For once, Mark didn't interrupt. He watched, listened, asked a few short questions. His expression was difficult to read, somewhere between concentration and calculation. When I finished, the room was quiet except for the muted murmur of the office outside. I waited. Finally, he leaned back fully in his chair and exhaled through his nose, the corners of his mouth curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. Well, he said slowly, you've clearly put a lot of thought into this. That phrase, a lot of thought, wasn't praise. It was distance. Still, I believed. I believed because the math was undeniable, because the logic was airtight, because for the first time since the crisis started, I wasn't just reacting to fear. I was offering a way forward. I didn't know it yet, but that belief was about to be tested in ways I couldn't possibly calculate. Mark sat in silence for a few seconds longer than necessary. I recognized the move. Executive theater. The pause wasn't for thinking, it was for positioning. I stayed still, hands folded loosely in my lap, forcing myself not to fill the space. The plan sat open between us, 63 pages of clarity waiting to be acknowledged. Finally, he smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. Look, he said, leaning forward now, fingers steepled. I appreciate the initiative. I really do. It's good to see people being proactive in times like this. There it was, the soft landing, the verbal cushioning before the fall. But, he continued, drawing the word out slightly, this plan, while very thorough, isn't exactly realistic. My chest tightened, though my face stayed neutral. Which part? I asked carefully. Mark waved a hand in the air as if brushing away specifics. The overall framing. You're looking at this from a purely analytical angle. Numbers, structures, reductions. That's understandable, given your role. But it's not how things work at the executive level. I felt heat rise behind my eyes. Not anger yet. Something closer to disbelief. "I've accounted for implementation risks," I said. "The projections are conservative. If anything, I undercut the expected gains to—" He chuckled softly and leaned back again, cutting me off without raising his voice. "See, that right there. That's what I mean. You're assuming operations exist in a vacuum. They don't. People don't react the way spreadsheets say they will." I glanced at the org chart on the screen. They certainly react worse when salaries are late. The smile faded, for just a fraction of a second. Mark didn't like being challenged directly. Everyone knew that. I had just done it anyway. "You have to understand," he said coolly. "There are considerations you're not privy to. Investor psychology, board dynamics, strategic optics, cutting too deeply, too quickly. That creates panic, and shifting focus to a niche revenue stream at this stage, that tells the market we're retreating." "We are retreating," I said before I could stop myself. "The difference is whether we do it deliberately or pretend we're still advancing." Silence dropped hard between us. Mark's jaw tightened ever so slightly. He stood up from his chair, not abruptly, but with purpose, and walked to the window behind his desk. For a moment he stared out at the city, hands in his pockets, the posture of a man accustomed to being deferred to. Then he turned back. "This company didn't get where it is by playing small," he said. "We're in a rough patch, yes, but rough patches pass. What you're proposing is a fundamental shift in identity." I swallowed. "It's a shift in survival." He shook his head, amused now. "You're smart. No one's questioning that. But experience matters. Perspective matters. There's a reason these decisions don't come from mid-level analysts." There it was, the line in the sand. I closed the laptop slowly, the soft click sounding louder than it should have. "So, what happens now?" I asked. Mark returned to his chair and sat, the conversation already over in his mind. "I'll take some time to think through a few elements," he said diplomatically. "But for now, let's stay the course. We're already working on some high-level solutions." "What solutions?" The question slipped out before I could reassess it. He smiled again, fully this time. "Executive-level ones." I gathered my laptop and stood. My legs felt oddly heavy, like gravity had increased while I wasn't paying attention. "At least consider the cost reductions," I said quietly. "Even partial implementation would buy time." "We'll see," Mark replied, his eyes already drifting back to his monitor. "Good work, though. Really. Good work." The phrase echoed in my head as I walked out of his office, down the hallway, past rows of people who had no idea how close the edge really was. No one looked up as I passed. No applause. No acknowledgement that I had just tried, earnestly, desperately, to change the company's trajectory. At my desk, I sat staring at my blank screen. Humiliation settled in slowly, like sediment. I replayed the conversation piece by piece, searching for the flaw, not in the plan, but in myself. Had I pushed too hard? Used the wrong language? Threatened his authority without meaning to? Maybe I should have framed it differently. Maybe I should have softened the conclusions. Maybe... No. The numbers were right. That wasn't arrogance. It was certainty. By mid-afternoon, the familiar office noise returned in fragments. Forced laughter, shallow optimism, productivity theater. I answered emails, ran routine reports, did my job. No one mentioned the delayed salaries anymore, as if ignoring the problem might somehow fix it. Around 4 o'clock, Mark passed by my desk on his way to a closed-door meeting. He didn't look at me, not once. That stung more than the dismissal itself. On the train home, I watched my reflection in the darkened window again. This time, I didn't see doubt. I saw something harder forming beneath it, resolve sharpened by insult. If executive-level thinking meant ignoring reality until it became catastrophic, then fine. Let them lead. I had said my piece. I had done my part. And if the company went under now, it wouldn't be because the warning signs hadn't been there. It would be because the wrong people had chosen not to listen. The all-hands meeting was scheduled for Friday at 10. That alone was suspicious. Leadership only called company-wide meetings at two extremes, celebration or damage control. No one celebrated on a Friday morning, which meant this was the other kind. The kind designed to calm nerves without actually answering questions. The calendar invite said, company update, path forward, and included every employee, from interns to senior directors. By 9:55, the auditorium-style conference room was packed. Overflow employees leaned against walls or sat on the floor with laptops balanced on their knees. The air buzzed with low whispers, nervous energy bouncing from person to person like static before a storm. I took a seat near the middle, close enough to see the stage clearly, but far enough to disappear if I needed to. My laptop stayed closed. I already knew what the numbers said. What mattered now was what leadership would say. Mark sat front row, confident as ever, chatting with two VPs as if this were a quarterly pep talk instead of a financial intervention. He laughed at something one of them said, relaxed, perfectly at ease. It was hard to reconcile that image with the way he had dismissed me barely days earlier. Then the lights dimmed. Our CEO took the stage first, delivering 10 minutes of polished reassurance, acknowledging challenges, emphasizing resilience, thanking everyone for their dedication. The words flowed smoothly, practiced, almost soothing, until the slide behind him changed. My stomach tightened. I recognized the structure instantly, not the numbers yet, the framework, the flow, cost stabilization, structural alignment, revenue focus. My pulse began to climb. The CEO spoke in broad strokes, outlining the gravity of the situation before pivoting to a concrete, actionable recovery strategy developed by leadership. He gestured to Mark, inviting him to the podium. Applause followed. Automatic. Conditioned. Mark stood, adjusted his jacket, and took the stage with an easy smile. The big screen behind him changed again. There it was, my plan. Not similar, not inspired by. Mine. The same three-phase structure, the same sequencing logic. Even the phrasing, surgical cost reductions, streamlined ownership, strength-led revenue optimization. Words I had chosen deliberately because they balanced honesty with reassurance. My palms went cold. Mark spoke with confidence, walking the room through each phase as if the ideas were unfolding in real time. He clicked through slides I had designed in a different color scheme, presenting charts I had built with slightly rounded numbers, softened just enough for public consumption. I scanned the room. Heads nodded. People leaned forward. I saw relief flicker across faces as the logic began to settle in. Murmurs of approval rippled quietly. This was what everyone had been desperate to hear. Clarity, direction, competence. And Mark was delivering it flawlessly. Except he wasn't. Because beneath the polish, I could hear my voice in every sentence. This approach allows us to stabilize cash flow quickly without undermining long-term growth, Mark said. I had written that. By aligning teams around outcomes rather than titles, we regain operational agility. Also mine. When he reached the revenue section, my chest tightened further. He described the feature-led pricing model with conviction, positioning it as an untapped strength discovered through leadership analysis. I gripped the edge of the chair. Not once did he pause. Not once did he glance my way. Not once did he credit the work to its source. Not even obliquely. The room erupted into applause at the end. Sustained. Genuine. Desperate applause from people who needed to believe this would work. Mark soaked it in, nodding graciously, hands raised slightly in acknowledgement. For a brief, poisonous second, I considered standing up. I imagined it vividly, my chair scraping back, my voice cutting through the noise, calmly stating the truth. I imagined the stunned silence that would follow, the way the narrative would fracture in real time. Then I imagined the aftermath, the closed-door meetings, the reputation shift, being labeled not a team player. Vindicated, maybe, but unemployed. The applause faded. The meeting moved into a Q&A segment. Mark deflected questions smoothly, leaning on the plan structure without ever diving too deep into mechanics. He didn't need to. On paper, it was airtight, because I had made it that way. As people began filing out, the energy in the room had changed. Still anxious, but steadier. Hope, fragile and tentative, had been reintroduced into the system. I stayed seated long after most had left. The realization settled slowly, heavy and unmistakable. It wasn't just that he had taken my work, it was that he understood enough to present it, but not enough to own it. That distinction mattered more than he knew. I stood and walked out with the rest, my expression carefully neutral. A few colleagues smiled at me in passing, buoyed by what they'd just heard. "Feeling better after that, huh?" someone said. I nodded. "Sure." As I reached my desk, an email notification popped up. "Great work today. Exciting times ahead." From Mark. I stared at the message for a long moment. Then I closed it without replying. That was the moment I understood the full shape of what had happened. Not just theft, but dependency. Mark had taken the plan, but he hadn't taken the understanding that came from building it. And whether he realized it or not, he had just tied his success to something he couldn't fully maintain on his own. I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. And clarity, I would soon learn, is far more dangerous. The plan worked. Not immediately, not in the cinematic way people imagine turnarounds, but in the slow, quiet way that only numbers can confirm. Expenses began to shrink in the right places. Departments that had been hemorrhaging cash were either restructured or quietly merged. Contracts were renegotiated. Tools disappeared from invoices. Meetings got shorter. Decisions, oddly enough, got faster. And the numbers responded. Cash burn slowed within the first month. By the second, projections stopped free-falling. By the third, the word runway started appearing in leadership decks again, not as a warning, but as a resource. Salaries were paid on time. People noticed. The office atmosphere shifted from suffocating dread to cautious optimism. No one celebrated. We were too traumatized for that. But shoulders lifted. Conversations returned. The coffee machine resumed its sacred role as a gathering point instead of an altar to stress. And at the center of it all stood Mark Reynolds. His calendar filled with meetings he hadn't been invited to before. Board members wanted updates. His updates. Investors wanted reassurance. His reassurance. He walked through the office with a new gravity, the kind that comes from believing you've proven something important. Leadership emails started referencing Mark's strategy. Someone printed a slide from an investor memo and pinned it near the kitchenette. Operational discipline under Mark Reynolds' guidance has stabilized outlook. I stared at it while stirring sugar into coffee I didn't want. No one looked at me. I kept working. Not out of loyalty, Not exactly, but because the plan still needed hands. Execution is where strategies go to die, and I refused to let mine become another cautionary tale just because the wrong person was getting credit. So I adjusted projections quietly, fixed misinterpretations, smoothed over inconsistencies before they surfaced. When Mark misunderstood a dependency, I clarified it, carefully, privately, without attaching ownership. When a department implemented a cost cut in a way that would backfire 3 months later, I sent a data-backed email suggesting a tweak. Always suggestions, never corrections. Mark never asked where the insights came from. He didn't need to. They just appeared. Like the plan itself had momentum, like success arrived naturally if you were standing in the right place to receive it. The announcement came on a Tuesday, another all-hands meeting. This one felt different the moment I walked in, lighter, smugger. Leadership smiles instead of tight jaws. The CEO spoke again, this time with genuine enthusiasm. Then he paused. I want to recognize the individual who has led this recovery effort with clarity, confidence, and vision. I felt it before he said the name. Mark Reynolds. Applause thundered. Mark stood, visibly humbled, or well-practiced at appearing so. He thanked leadership, thanked the teams, spoke about collective effort while embodying individual triumph. The words promotion and expanded responsibility floated through the room, wrapped in corporate reverence. Senior Director, effective immediately. I clapped too. Everyone did. Not because they believed the myth completely, but because stories like this are comforting. They suggest order. They suggest competence rises. They suggest someone is in control. After the meeting, colleagues crowded around Mark's office to congratulate him. I walked past without stopping. At my desk, an email slid into my inbox. I couldn't have done this without the team. Appreciate your support these past months. Support. I reread the word several times, tasting its meaning. Not your work, not your insight. Support. It was accurate in a way that stung. That evening, as I packed up to leave, I caught sight of Mark through the glass wall of his new office. Office, now singular and spacious. He was on a call, pacing, animated, confident. A man elevated by a structure he didn't fully understand but believed he owned. For the first time since this began, something shifted inside me. Not anger, not jealousy, but awareness. I saw the asymmetry clearly now. Mark's success wasn't self-sustaining. It was borrowed. And borrowed things require maintenance. I stepped into the elevator and let the doors close, the applause still echoing faintly in my mind. Everyone thought this was the end of the story, the crisis resolved, the hero rewarded. But I knew better because the plan was still alive, and so was the decision I hadn't yet made. Mark's promotion changed the rhythm of everything, except my workload. Officially, nothing about my role shifted. Same title, same salary, same expectations neatly outlined in an HR document that hadn't been updated in years. Unofficially, I became the quiet correction mechanism behind an increasingly visible leader. The first sign came a week after his promotion. He sent an email late in the evening, brief, casual. Quick question on the revenue model. Can you sanity check a few assumptions before tomorrow? No context. No attachment yet. Just enough urgency implied to make saying no feel irresponsible. I responded with a neutral sure, and within minutes, a spreadsheet arrived. It was close. Too close to be coincidence. But a handful of assumptions had drifted. Small errors, nothing catastrophic in isolation, but enough to compound into something dangerous if left unchecked. Churn rates rounded too optimistically. Support costs underestimated after restructuring, a dependency between features overlooked entirely. I fixed them quietly, added short comments explaining why, not just what, and sent it back. Mark replied with a thumbs-up emoji. The pattern repeated. In meetings I wasn't invited to, decisions were made that leaned heavily on numbers I knew intimately. Afterwards, clarifying emails would land in my inbox. Does this hold? Is this still safe if we scale? Can you pressure test this scenario? Always phrased as quick checks, never framed as reliance. I answered everyone. Part of me told myself it was temporary, that Mark was still acclimating to a larger role, that once momentum stabilized, my involvement would taper off. Another part of me recognized the deeper truth. He understood the shape of the strategy, but not its internal logic. He could repeat conclusions, but not derive them. I was the derivation. What no one saw was the invisible labor required to keep the illusion intact. The late nights recalibrating forecasts after leadership tweaks. The quiet warnings phrased as questions so egos could save face. The constant mental vigilance, watching for misalignments before they became visible cracks. Once, during a leadership review, Mark confidently referenced a metric that didn't exist. Not anymore. I caught it the night before. If I hadn't, someone on the board would have asked for a breakdown he couldn't provide. Instead, the slide deck was updated. The question never came. Mark later stopped by my desk, hands in pockets, wearing that now familiar air of authority. "Good save," he said lightly. "Didn't want to get bogged down in weeds." I nodded. "Happy to help." And I meant it, at least partially, because the plan still mattered to me. The people did. Claire from accounting, who smiled more easily now that her paychecks arrived on time. The junior engineer who told me, quietly, that he'd stopped updating his resume. The teams who believed stability meant safety. So I kept helping, behind the curtain. But the cost was subtle and cumulative. Mark grew more confident, less curious. He interrupted more in meetings, deferred less to subject matter experts. He trusted the strategy because it worked, and he trusted himself because he was associated with it. Questions he once forwarded to me, he now answered on his own. Sometimes correctly, sometimes not. I watched carefully, intervening only when necessary. Correcting too often would reveal dependence. Correcting too rarely would allow damage. It was a delicate balance, one I never agreed to manage, but somehow owned. One evening, as I shut down my computer, I realized I couldn't remember the last time Mark had said thank you. Not that it mattered. Gratitude wasn't what I was missing. What unsettled me was something else entirely. If I stopped tomorrow, truly stopped, how long would it take before the cracks became visible? I ran the scenario in my head the way I ran everything else. Weeks. Maybe less. I imagined him in a boardroom, confronted with a second-order question, a dependency, a contradiction, a moment where confidence wouldn't be enough. And for the first time, I understood the real leverage I had never intended to hold. Not exposure, absence. The elevator ride home felt longer that night. The city outside rushed past in streaks of light while my thoughts slowed, sharpening instead of scattering. I didn't want revenge, but I did want truth. And I was starting to see that as long as I kept quietly propping everything up, the truth would never surface. I hadn't decided anything yet, but the idea had lodged itself firmly in place. And ideas, once embedded, are very difficult to remove. The decision didn't arrive all at once. There was no dramatic morning where I woke up enlightened, no single insult that tipped the balance. It crept in quietly, disguised as restraint, logic, professionalism. the same qualities I had relied on my entire career. It started with a choice so small it barely registered. An email. Mark sent it late on a Thursday evening, subject line vague, tone familiar. Can you take a quick look at these assumptions before they go out tomorrow? Normally, I would have replied within minutes. Normally, I would have opened the spreadsheet, traced the logic, corrected the inevitable drift, and sent it back cleaner than I found it. That night, I didn't. I read the message once, then again. Then I closed my laptop and went to bed. In the morning, nothing catastrophic had happened. The office still stood. The company still existed. The world hadn't noticed my inaction in the slightest. Mark followed up mid-morning with a thumbs-up message. No worries, went ahead with it. I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The next week, I made another adjustment, this time deliberate. I attended meetings. I contributed when asked. I completed tasks clearly outlined in my role. I answered questions directed at me. What I didn't do was anticipate. I didn't scan decks ahead of time. I didn't run shadow analyses on decisions I wasn't responsible for. I didn't stay late correcting work no one had assigned me. I did my job. Exactly my job. The effect wasn't immediate. For a while, everything continued on momentum alone, like a train coasting after the engine cuts power. Mark still spoke confidently. Meetings still ended with action items. The plan still existed, robust enough to absorb minor mistakes. But decision-making slowed. Clarifications turned into debates. Questions that once had immediate answers now circled, unresolved. I watched it happen from my seat, silent not out of defiance, but out of discipline. This was the boundary. It was odd. How doing less felt heavier than doing more. I had internalized responsibility for outcomes I didn't own. Stepping back felt like negligence, even when it was simply accuracy. Mark noticed eventually. He stopped by my desk mid-afternoon, leaning casually against the partition. "You've been quieter lately," he said. Not accusing, observing. "Just focused on my deliverables," I replied. "True, precise." He nodded slowly. "Well, let me know if you see anything off." I met his gaze. "Absolutely." And I meant that too, because if something clearly crossed into my remit, I would speak. I wasn't sabotaging. I wasn't withholding information. I was just no longer compensating for gaps that weren't mine to fill. That distinction mattered. Days passed. Then weeks. The first real sign arrived during a leadership meeting I happened to attend, one of the few where cross-functional analysts were invited for context. Mark presented updated projections. They were optimistic. Not wildly. Just enough. A VP asked a follow-up question, a good one, second order, quietly dangerous. The kind that exposed whether someone understood not just the numbers, but the machinery beneath them. Mark hesitated. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Barely noticeable. But I noticed. He answered eventually, deflecting slightly, promising to follow up. The meeting moved on. No one pressed. Yet something subtle shifted in the room. A hairline fracture in confidence. Afterward, walking back to my desk, I felt it clearly for the first time. This wasn't about punishment. It was about alignment. For months, I had blurred the lines between responsibility and rescue. I had mistaken stewardship for self-erasure. By always intervening, I had ensured success, but not understanding. Continuity, but not truth. And truth, I realized, doesn't need advocates. It just needs space. That evening, as I shut down my computer on time, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not satisfaction, not yet, but calm. I wasn't angry at Mark anymore. I wasn't even disappointed. I simply no longer believed it was my role to be invisible scaffolding for someone else's ascent. The company would now learn what it actually depended on, and so would he. Not through confrontation, not through exposure, but through absence. At first, everything looked fine. That was the dangerous part. Key metrics held steady, at least on the surface. Dashboards stayed green. Leadership emails continued their optimistic cadence, encouraging trends, measured progress, continued stabilization. The organization was still running on the momentum of decisions already made, processes already set in motion. But momentum decays, and without correction, decay becomes visible. The first crack appeared in a report no one paid much attention to: monthly support costs. They came in slightly higher than forecast. Nothing alarming. Easily blamed on transitional friction. Mark waved it off in a meeting, confident the variance would correct itself next cycle. It didn't. A week later, marketing flagged a decline in lead quality. Sales responded by pushing harder on volume, discounting to compensate. The pricing model, delicate by design, started bending under pressure. I saw it immediately. I said nothing. Not because I hadn't noticed, not because I wanted failure, but because this moment, this specific sequence, had never been part of my job description. In the past, I would have sent a note, gently flagging second-order effects. I would have protected the system from misinterpretation. This time, I watched. Meetings grew longer. The questions changed too, not louder, not angrier, just more precise. Directors asked for clarifications where once they nodded. Follow-ups multiplied. Action items returned unresolved. Mark adapted the way many leaders do under subtle pressure, by leaning harder on confidence. His language sharpened. Certainty replaced curiosity. He spoke more, listened less, and he started making decisions faster. That was when the cracks spread. A cost reduction slated to be temporary quietly became permanent, breaking a dependency no one had mapped outside the original plan. A vendor renegotiation closed without revisiting downstream impacts. A weekly performance deck duplicated metrics with conflicting implications. Once, during a meeting, two charts contradicted each other. Mark didn't notice. Someone else did. "Which one is correct?" a board observer asked, voice neutral. Mark hesitated again. Just a fraction. Then he laughed lightly, brushing it off as a formatting issue. "We'll reconcile offline," he said. Offline became often. I started noticing how frequently Mark deferred follow-ups now, how often certainty ended with "we'll circle back," how the plan, my plan, was being repeated without recalibration, applied as doctrine instead of as a living system. Without understanding, repetition becomes ritual. People felt it too, even if they couldn't name it. Conversations near the coffee machine shifted. Hope didn't vanish. It narrowed. Confidence became conditional. A manager pulled me aside one afternoon and asked, quietly, "Do you still feel good about where this is going?" I answered honestly, "I think we're still okay." I didn't say why, or for how long. Mark stopped emailing me entirely. That should have relieved me. Instead, it confirmed what I already knew. He believed he no longer needed me. The absence did its work patiently. By the end of the quarter, projections slipped just enough to trigger concern. Not panic. Concern. The board scheduled an unscheduled review. Leadership prepped harder. Mark spent longer hours in his office, door closed, lights on late. One evening, as I was packing up on time, still a strange habit, I passed his office and caught a glimpse of him staring at a spreadsheet, brow furrowed, posture rigid. Not confused, cornered. For a brief moment, I felt an impulse to help, to step in, to restore balance. The system was faltering, and I knew exactly where, exactly why. But then I remembered something essential. No one had asked me to build the original plan. They had simply taken it. Ownership, I was finally learning, isn't about who fixes the problem. It's about who is expected to. The cracks were visible now, not catastrophic, not yet, but undeniable. And once people see cracks, they start tracing their origin. Soon, someone would ask Mark a question he couldn't deflect, and this time, there would be nowhere for the answer to come from. The invitation came through Mark's assistant. Special board review. Attendance required. 3 words that never appeared together by accident. The meeting was scheduled for early Monday morning, the kind of time slot chosen to reduce hallway conversations and increase seriousness by sheer inconvenience. I wasn't sure why I was included. Analysts rarely were. But the agenda listed operational clarifications, and that acknowledgement alone told me everything. The room felt colder than usual. Board members sat straighter, less patient. The casual familiarity that had emerged during the recovery phase was gone, replaced by sharp attention and sharpened pencils. Mark sat at the head of the table, shoulders square, face composed. Too composed. He opened with confidence, summarizing progress, reaffirming the strategy, walking through metrics that still looked acceptable, barely. Then the questions began. They were surgical, not emotional, not loud, targeted. A board member leaned forward. "Can you walk us through the cascading impact of the last pricing adjustment on support demand?" Mark answered, but shallowly. "High level. Safe." Another question followed. Why did we treat last month's retention variance as noise rather than signal? This one took longer. Mark glanced at his notes, then at the screen. Silence stretched. Not long, but long enough. The cadence was gone now. He spoke, corrected himself, spoke again. Then someone asked the wrong question. Wrong, because it wasn't hostile. "Can you explain this metric?" a board member said, pointing to a figure on the screen. "Not what it represents, but why it behaves as it does under stress." The room went quiet. I knew the answer instantly. I knew it because I had lived inside that mechanism for months, had tuned it, stressed it, weakened it deliberately so it wouldn't snap at scale. Mark didn't know. He tried. He spoke about market behavior, user psychology, externalities, all adjacent, all plausible, none correct. The chairman closed his notebook slowly. "Mark," he said calmly, "who designed this framework?" A beat. Mark smiled reflexively. "Well, I led the initiative in collaboration with whom?" the chairman pressed. The smile thinned. Mark glanced down the table, once, briefly. His eyes passed over me without settling, like I was part of the furniture. "My team," he said, "collectively." The chairman nodded, unconvinced. "Then I suggest we hear from the individual who understands it at a functional level." Every head turned. To me. The air shifted, heavy and unmistakable. Mark froze. I felt surprisingly calm. I didn't volunteer. I didn't gloat. I simply answered the question that followed, clearly, deliberately, without embellishment. I explained the metric's behavior, the dependencies, the impact of recent deviations. I spoke not as a challenger, but as a witness. Each sentence tightened the noose, not through accusation, but through contrast. The board asked follow-ups. I answered them too. No one stopped me. Mark didn't speak again. The meeting ended quietly, efficiently. No raised voices, no scene. Just conclusions forming behind attentive eyes. By Wednesday, the announcement went out. Mark Reynolds was stepping down to pursue other opportunities. No applause, no farewell email. His office was cleared by Friday afternoon. The glass walls reflected emptiness where authority had once stood. People whispered. The story fractured into theories, politics, pressure, misalignment. Few guessed the truth. Fewer still guessed my role. I returned to my desk and completed my tasks. Nothing about my title changed. Nothing about my compensation adjusted. But when leadership passed my desk now, they nodded. Acknowledgement, at last. It felt anticlimactic. I didn't feel victorious. I felt resolved. Because the fall hadn't been pushed. It had simply been unsupported. And gravity, once allowed to do its work, is very efficient. Life after Mark was quieter than I expected. No dramatic shift, no cathartic release. The company didn't suddenly transform into a meritocracy, nor did leadership gather everyone to correct the story of its near collapse. Instead, what followed was something far more typical and far more honest. The machine adjusted. An interim director stepped in. Meetings became more cautious. Assumptions were questioned aloud again. Strategy documents grew heavier with footnotes and lighter with bravado. The plan, still the same at its core, was treated less like scripture and more like a framework. Modified, tested, respected for what it was. It worked better that way. No one ever publicly credited me for its origin. My name never appeared on a slide deck or in a retrospective email. I wasn't promoted. I wasn't singled out. I remained what I had always been on paper, a senior analyst who did solid work. For a while, I thought that might bother me. It didn't. What did change was subtler. People started asking me questions directly. Not because I demanded it, but because they now knew where answers came from. Not all the time, not formally, just enough to matter. Once, during a review meeting, a director paused mid-discussion and said, "Let's check this with you before we commit." The sentence wasn't dramatic. No one noticed except me, but I did. Claire from accounting stopped by my desk one afternoon, smiling. "You know," she said, "things feel real now. Less performative." I nodded. "That's usually a sign things are healthier." She tilted her head. "Did you ever think about leaving?" "I did," I said honestly. "But you didn't." "No," I said. "I stayed long enough to finish something." And that was the truth. Mark's name faded quickly. Corporate memory is efficient that way. 1 quarter later, his tenure had become a footnote. Prior leadership decisions, lessons learned, organizational evolution. The success remained. The myth did not. Sometimes, late in the evening, I thought about how easily I could have confronted him, exposed him, forced the truth into the open in that first meeting, or the second, or the 10th time my work was reused without attribution. It would have felt good, briefly, but it would have cost me credibility, peace, and something harder to regain, clarity. What I learned instead was quieter and infinitely more useful. Power isn't always taken. Often it's lent. And people who borrow it without understanding assume it's theirs until the support quietly disappears. I never sought revenge. I never raised my voice. I never demanded acknowledgement. I simply stopped holding up someone else's success. And when I did, the truth stood on its own. Months later, as I shut down my computer one evening, on time still, I caught my reflection in the darkened screen. The face looking back wasn't triumphant. It was steady. I finally understood that competence isn't proven by how loudly it's displayed, but by how much collapses when it's removed. And that more than any title or applause, was the lesson worth keeping.